Just how long do you think a worldwide conspiracy can be kept secret from the entire population? Can a small group of people maintain secrecy about world issues? Where does the disinformation end and the conspiracy begin? In the United States, where the Air Force investigated flying saucers for more than 20 years, the Pentagon has stated that it has no reason to continue these investigations, that all information collected to date is available, and that it has nothing to hide where UFOs are concerned. Not everyone agrees with this statement. Through legal means, American UFO experts have forced several government agencies, such as the NSA, CIA, and FBI, to release hundreds of pages of documents which they had previously claimed did not exist. If we add to these lies rumors of recovered spaceships and intimidating men in black, then the idea of a worldwide cover-up doesn't seem so far-fetched. But is there any truth to these rumors? In 1989, a man named Robert Lazar came out with wild speculations regarding secret military facilities in the Nevada desert, the legendary Area 51.
Alors Robert Lazar est un personnage assez critiqué, même extrêmement critiqué.
Bob Lazar has received a lot of criticism.
Physicien qui a,
He was a young physicist who made a sensational statement
racontant qu'il avait
that he had worked for a short time at an ultra-secret underground military base known as Area 51, near Groom Lake, north of Las Vegas.
Au nord de Las Vegas. Et
he claimed that he had been hired to study the recovered spaceships.
Pour étudier des ovnis récupérés.
I think perhaps the most controversial claims were those of Bob Lazar, who claims he was a nuclear physicist taken to a secret base 15 miles south of Groom Lake at Papoose Dry Lake and asked to work on the part of the propulsion system of an alien vehicle. Unfortunately, Bob Lazar claims he is a nuclear physicist. That's absolute nonsense. He doesn't have any degrees of any kind whatsoever. And when Stanton Friedman asked him basic questions about physics, known, in high school textbooks, he was unable to answer them.
But Lazar's problems were more than academic. In 1990, he was arrested and charged with pandering. In the field of investigation, it is said that information is only as reliable as its source. Robert Lazar's credibility is rather doubtful. But thanks to him, it became public knowledge that odd things were happening at Area 51. Several films were produced by amateurs near Groom Lake, showing bright objects performing aviation maneuvers that were out of the ordinary. Were these objects the byproduct of alien technology? Since the Groom Lake facilities were built in 1954 as a result of an agreement between the CIA and the Lockheed Aviation Corporation, they have been used to develop secret aircraft such as the U-2, the SR-71 Blackbird, and stealth aircraft such as the F-117A and the B-2 bomber. These days, with an increase in the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, aircraft capable of performing feats that are impossible for conventional aircraft, it's only natural for us to wonder about the object seen over Area 51. The rumor still persists that the military secretly recovered an alien spaceship and used it to make technological advances. Shortly before he died in 1998, Colonel Philip Corso, a retired American military officer, published a book called The Day After Roswell. Corso described how the Army tried to make technological advances using a spaceship that was recovered in 1947 near Roswell, New Mexico.
According to his story, at one point, his boss at the Pentagon, General Trudeau, gave him UFO remnants that had been stored in an Army locker. I've intentionally mentioned that it was the Army, since it seems that it was mostly the Air Force and perhaps the Marines who led the secret operations. The Army was more behind the scenes. Maybe they had wanted to play a role at that point. So, Trudeau gave these remnants to Colonel Corso to play around with and try to find some use for. They decided to pass the remnants on to a few laboratories very secretly, with the instructions to do what you want with this, try to find some way of using it, and patent your ideas.
One thing that was supposedly developed using alien technology was the transistor. Unfortunately, upon checking with the patent office, we discovered that these semiconductors were patented well before the Roswell affair. But French scientist Jean-Pierre Petit, one of the main researchers into magnetohydrodynamics, or MHD, believes that alien technology has been used to make human technological advances. In his most recent book, UFOs and Classified American Weapons, he said that while attending a conference on advanced propulsion, a few of his American counterparts confided some surprising information.
When I discussed the matter with American scientists, they were quite glib. They admitted to having recovered an alien hypersonic shuttle in Roswell in 1947, not a ship designed for long space travel. So from then on, they had concrete evidence that MHD existed. A decision was made from above that we don't want a repeat of what happened with the atomic bomb. We want this to stay strictly American. So I want you to disinform the public. Their plan worked magnificently. What's interesting is that MHD sank like a ship. It just disappeared altogether in the early 1970s. In the US, they had developed it in Area 51 in an ultra-secret underground laboratory. I went to Berkeley to give a lecture in 1987 at the invitation of my friend Tony Oppenheim, who worked for the Department of Fluid Mechanics. In the back of the room sat a Professor Kunkel, who was constantly fidgeting. And Oppenheim said to Kunkel, "Why were you so fidgety during the lecture?" And Kunkel replied, "I'm very embarrassed because a lot of what that Frenchman was saying is actually being studied in secret labs here in the United States, like Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. But here it's such a secret that I'm not even authorized to talk about it." Here he was seeing this French scientist casually explaining MHD to second-year students when it was supposed to be top secret in the United States. So it was a bit of a blunder. That's why the Americans were laughing. As people from Brighton told me, our military secrets are in your comic books.
As it turns out, the information on MHD was not the only thing that was revealed to Professor Petit. He also learned that Americans supposedly had a torpedo capable of traveling 2,000 miles per hour and a hypersonic airplane capable of orbiting Earth. What's more, the U.S. had allegedly already sent manned flights to Mars. The scientist believed all of this information without hesitation. What if Jean-Pierre Petit was merely the victim of a disinformation scheme, like those accredited to the mysterious Men in Black? Among the favorite topics of conspiracy theorists is the strange Men in Black, who first appeared under rather odd circumstances.
Dans les années 50,
in the 1950s, other than UFO experts who belong to what we might call serious mainstream groups, it's hard to qualify groups like that, but some published books at the beginning of the UFO movement, so we might call them serious. Anyways, other than those serious groups, smaller groups popped up as well, one of which had a memorable character named Gray Barker. Gray Barker was an American who became interested in flying saucers in the early 1950s. He joined a small group on the East Coast led by UFO expert Albert Bender. This was about the time that the smaller groups were being created, when the article by Kehoe was published, and articles on the subject were appearing in major newspapers. A lot of people began thinking, hey, I'm interested in that too. I think I'll start my own group, or I'll publish a fan magazine, or I'll write books on the subject. In actual fact, not too many people wrote books. Most wrote bulletins. So there were quite a few small groups. Gray Barker joined a group that claimed to have contacts around the world. Each time that someone wrote to them, the person would become a contact, so their network spread quickly. And then something odd happened to this group. Its president, Al Bender, suddenly dropped all of his activities. This was a mystery to his friends who wondered what had happened. He told them that he had been visited by 3 mysterious men in black who told him to drop his interest in the subject. Apparently he was too close to the truth, which made him a dangerous element, and these men had come to intimidate him and tell him to drop the subject. These men were dressed in black, wore felt hats, and drove a Cadillac just like the stereotypes seen in the movie of the same name, Men in Black. This was the first report of the Men in Black.
Et Gray Barker,
Unlike Bender, Gray Barker decided not to drop the subject, and he decided to investigate the matter.
enquêté sur cette histoire.
In 1956, he wrote a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers,
Et qui est le premier
which was
livre
the first book written on this subject.
sur ce thème.
Since then, the men in black have become a known element among UFO circles, although the subject remained on the fringes for a long time. Most ufologists did not take the matter seriously. These men in black were not attention grabbers like UFOs, which were a more serious issue, a more scientific matter. But the idea persisted over the years, and now the public in general has heard of men in black thanks to Hollywood.
In his book, Gray Barker gave the impression that these men in black might be federal agents, specifically FBI agents. That inference did not go unnoticed. In January 1959, the Federal Bureau of Investigation told its Chicago agents that it wanted a copy of Barker's book. They knew too much about flying saucers. Upon investigation, Edgar Hoover's men concluded that the FBI had not been involved in what happened to Albert Bender. Could someone else be interfering?
Gray Barker publie son livre en 1956.
Gray Barker published his book They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers in 1956.
Les ufologues vont faire
Over the next few years, several UFO experts visited Al Bender in the hopes of hearing his version of what had happened. But he remained silent.
Je crois qu'en
He didn't say anything or do anything.
publie un article
In 1958 or 1959, he wrote an article on so-called revelations,
qu'on l'a embêté.
but his article didn't really reveal anything.
Et en 62,
It just described how he had been harassed for years.
Barker qui publie le livre.
In 1962, Gray Barker published a book which was a manuscript prepared by Bender telling his version of the story.
Non seulement ça correspond pas à
The UFO community was disappointed, since this book did not reflect what Barker had said in his first book. The men in black were neither government agents nor fifth-column aliens. They were aliens based in the Antarctic. The story was nothing more than really bad science fiction. Most people I've spoken with in UFO circles believe that it was nothing more than fiction, and bad fiction at that, since he was claiming that these beings would materialize in his home out of thin air. They were male and female beings. In fact, Bender's manuscript even contained stories that bordered on eroticism. He claimed that the aliens took him to their base. They told him that they had come to Earth because our water contained some element that they needed for their planet. Supposedly, they headed back to their planet in 1960 or 1961, and that was when Bender could finally reveal his secret. Up until then, the aliens had been telling him, "Don't talk about this." And that was why Bender had given up his study group, because the extraterrestrial beings had politely asked him not to reveal their existence.
Très étrange. Ceci dit, elle va bien
As you can see, this story was very bizarre.
par rapport aux autres ufologues.
It reflected Bender's personality, since he was not a typical UFO expert.
Qu'il a rajouté puisqu'il a
Even Barker, who added his own personal notes to the book, since it seems that the manuscript was badly written, said that he had a hard time believing Bender's story.
cette histoire. Donc c'est un
So the whole issue of Men in Black got pushed to the fringes of the UFO community, even though it ended up being discussed more than other issues.
des dossiers.
Apart from the myth created by Barker and Bender, UFO literature is filled with stories of men in black. They seem to be everywhere in the 1960s. In 1967, the U.S. Air Force issued a memo to its staff advising them that individuals dressed in civilian clothes were posing as members of an elite branch of NORAD, visiting witnesses who had seen a UFO and asking them not to say anything about what they had seen. The Air Force also stated that these visitors were imposters, and any officer with information regarding these individuals should immediately notify his superiors. In her book, The Truth Behind Men in Black, British UFO expert Jenny Randalls describes dozens of cases where people were visited by men in black, extending from the 1950s up to the present. So if the MIB are not agents working for a secret government agency, then who are they?
I'm very interested by the so-called Men in Black cases. Undoubtedly there is a phenomenon of some sort here, whether it's connected to the UFO mystery or whether it's perhaps a separate but related paranormal phenomena, I don't know. But I can't help but think it's more likely that there are two rather more ordinary things going on here. Firstly, perhaps somebody deliberately hoaxing people who want to believe perhaps a little bit too much in extraterrestrials and playing a trick on them. Secondly, the sorts of people who do enjoy dressing as and pretending to be, say, secret agents. And it seems to me that it is a well-known psychological and psychiatric phenomenon that there are people, for example, who dress as police officers or as paramedics and who have their uniforms, and they enjoy, it fulfills some sort of psychological need to be seen in this role. It doesn't seem to me too far-fetched to suggest that a lot of people might enjoy posing as an agent of some shadowy government agency.
Is there a secret agency? Why not MJ-12? In November 1950, upon his return to Ottawa after a visit to the American capital, Wilbur Smith, an engineer working for the Federal Department of Transport, submitted a trip report to his superiors. Smith stated that in the U.S., the whole subject of flying saucers was classified more confidential than the H-bomb. And a group had been set up to study them, led by Dr. Vannevar Bush, President Truman's scientific advisor. Rumors of this secret group charged with studying flying saucers have persisted to this day. In the early 1950s, Captain Edward Ruppelt was director of Project Blue Book, an American committee set up to investigate UFOs. In his book, Reports on Unidentified Flying Objects, he explained that during his term as director, he had the feeling that a secret organization was also working on the same subject. What was this mysterious organization?
There are many MJ-12 documents. One of the documents that first came was the Eisenhower briefing document, and that arrived at the home of Jamie Chandray in the form of 2 rolls of undeveloped film, or maybe 1 roll of undeveloped film with 16 frames. But each of the frames sets now are in the possession of 2 people. One of them is Bill Moore, and the other is Jamie Chandray. They were identical sets, and I was able to get a copy of one of the sets from Jamie Chandray, which includes the famous Truman-Forrestal memo, which was the 1947 memo that presumably kicked off the Majestic 12 program.
The first 6 pages, apparently written in November 1952 and addressed to President-elect Dwight Eisenhower, were basically a briefing note describing the objectives of a project named Majestic 12, or MJ-12. This was followed by 2 pages of appendices and a memo dated September 24, 1947, signed by the President at that time, Harry Truman. In the memo, the President authorized Secretary of Defense James Forrestal to proceed with an operation referred to as MJ-12, with the assistance of Dr. Bush, the White House's scientific advisor. The documents were stamped top secret, magic, and eyes only.
The MJ-12 program was the program that was begun and initiated by Truman, according to the documents, in 1947. And it has remained, apparently, from the documents that I have, continuous under various names, but including Majestic 12 or MJ-12, up to at least 1976.
These documents focused on the Roswell affair and spoke of the creation of an ultra-secret group, Majestic 12, which was supposed to be aware of everything relating to UFOs in Roswell.
Since then, it appears that the scope of the program has broadened to understand how they work, maybe to begin some reverse engineering process, because one of the documents that I have from about 1952 seems to summarize what we've learned about the technologies.
These sheets were not the only ones of their kind. Over the next few years, other similar documents were sent to UFO experts, always anonymously. One of the most important documents was a sort of operating manual for MJ-12 agents.
After I retired in 1993, a friend of mine, Stan Friedman, who's well known in the UFO community, said that he thought that he knew that Don Berliner, who is actually the head of the Fund for UFO Research now, had received some documents in the mail that I might be interested in looking at. Okay. So I asked Don Berliner if he could share these documents with me. He ran a copy of them, but they weren't very good. So I went and visited Don in Washington, and together we found a black and white photographic shop and made extremely good copies, which I purchased. And then from those copies, I recreated the manual, which turns out to be a manual, a special operations manual, Psalm 101, that allegedly explains to the troops in the field how to recover a crashed UFO, how to deceive the public that there's anything there, and where to ship the bodies and where to send the parts.
When the first MJ-12 documents were received in the mid-1980s, several UFO experts studied them in the hopes of finding clues as to whether they were genuine or fake. Their results led to a general state of skepticism.
It seems clear to me that studies into these documents by investigators such as Barry Greenwood, Robert Todd, and others showed that these documents were fakes. First of all, in one of the memos allegedly signed by Truman, the president's signature had been photocopied from another document, which was genuine and which can be found at the National Archives Office. The rest was a mixture of items commonly found in UFO literature, but there was nothing that pointed to a real American operation. The authenticity of these documents was doubtful, and they were the beginning of a history of fakes, which show up in all areas, including UFO circles, unfortunately.
I think the test of time has not been good on MJ-12. Given the amount of whistleblowing, given the amount of ways in which secrets are really blown by a very invasive press and media, that something that big could be covered up that long is very difficult to believe. That the Americans could actually have a flying saucer and alien bodies over 50 years guarded by many troops, guarded by or used by scientists. Even the amount of cleaners that would have to go through a base on that over 50 years, there's a lot of people that if they could just produce one piece of proof that would blow the story, would interest anybody of a serious investigative reporting nature. And yet the serious investigative reporters, the sort of the Paxmans and the Cronkites, don't get involved in this kind of stuff because the real evidence that they would rely on, that they would demand, has not been forthcoming. MJ-12 looks good superficially until you ask, well, why was it given to those people? If you were a government person and you wanted people to know this, you could take that evidence with its kind of guarantees to people like Cronkite, and if you could convince them, then you've got your story out. To give it to UFO proponents is a guaranteed way almost of in fact getting it ridiculed. Now, if that was the government that actually gave the MJ-12 documents, I would suggest that it's not because the MJ-12 documents are genuine, but that the government wanted to see the rumour, to see how it would work and what would happen and so on. And if they're involved, then I think it was quite deliberate. And in fact, I believe Linda Moulton Howe, who is perhaps more famous for her work on animal mutilations and so on, she told the story of actually being taken into a room, being shown documents very much like MJ-12, then having them taken away from her and told never show those to anybody, never tell anybody you saw them. Well, the simple answer is, if you don't want her to tell anybody, why show it to them in the first place? Clearly, someone was trying to manipulate her. I think she was a bit savvy on this one, but clearly they were trying to manipulate her, and I think the release of those documents in the way they came out was another, perhaps slightly clumsy way of doing this kind of let's see what happens in the population, which I think is what's behind it.
Not many UFO experts believe in the MJ-12 affair. But if these documents were fake, then what explains the rumors about secret groups?
Other than MJ-12, there was an ongoing tradition of secret groups that supposedly studied UFOs, with most of these being American. This was mentioned in Ruppelt's book, Report on UFOs in 1956. He spoke of a group linked to the President of the United States that came to investigate his Blue Book files. Then there was Wilbur Smith in the 1950s, who wrote a memo mentioning how he had met with individuals from the American government. So there were a lot of stories circulating about these secret groups. As for Ruppelt's story, it seems obvious to me that the President would have had advisors keeping him informed of what was happening, and naturally they would have taken an interest in the UFO matter. We know that Americans studied UFOs. However, there are enough records available in public archives now for us to cross-check information. And I don't get the impression that there was a group spending all of its time on the matter. At least, it doesn't seem very likely.
Et j'ai pas l'impression qu'il y ait eu
It's possible that there were times when the subject was particularly sensitive, like during the wave of sightings in 1952 when UFOs were flying over Washington. And the president would have said to his advisors, I want a report on this. I want to know what's going on.
le président ait demandé à ses conseillers.
Also, during periods of tension with the Russians, the U.S. government might have been interested in certain matters. That's highly likely. But there's been no ongoing effort since then. And what's important to remember is that these individuals did not have the answers. That's important. In any conspiracy theory, there is a tendency to think that people in power know everything about the matter. The attitude is that they've known everything from the start. My impression is that they were just as lost as everyone else, and they were asking themselves the same questions. So it's hard to imagine that they worked continually on the UFO issue, unless they found something along the way, which doesn't seem very likely. Obviously, they asked themselves the same questions as everyone else, but they didn't find any answers. And UFOs were not their number one problem at the time. They had other fish to fry. If UFOs had been clearly linked to the Russians at the time, then it would have been a highly sensitive matter. I'm sure it would have occurred to them, but they would have eliminated that theory. UFOs were neither aliens nor Russians. They tended to have the attitude that it's only a pop culture phenomenon. Psychologists succeeded in calming down the population. It was a time when people were still strongly superstitious, although that tendency was starting to fade. It was easy to sweep the problem under the carpet.
It is my belief that something like that type of organization has existed, and whether or not something like that still exists, I'm not as certain, but I'm willing to guess that it probably does. I say this on the basis of a variety of statements made by former Air Force officer Edward Ruppelt, who I think alluded to the existence of such an organization. I also believe that I think it makes sense, to be quite honest with you. You know, let us play a little historical game, and let's pretend that the year is 1947 and that your name is Harry Truman. And let us just say for the moment that you indeed have information or even possibly technology that is alien in origin. What would you do? Certainly we know that in 1947 the United States did have a monopoly of very important technology, and that was nuclear technology. In 1947, the United States had a monopoly of working nuclear bombs. And at that time, the entire rest of the world was pounding at the door of the United Nations, basically wanting the U.S. to make nuclear technology public under the control of the UN. And the United States' answer at that time was absolutely no way. We know this. So therefore, ask yourself a very simple question. If they're not willing to let atomic technology out to the rest of the world, what would they possibly do with something as exotic as alien technology? Well, I think the answer would be to make it a secret from yourself, even, as possible, knowing that Soviet agents did indeed penetrate your own scientific and intelligence community, which was certainly the case. It would be something that you would want to have as much a high degree of security protocol as possible around. That's a hypothesis. However, I think it's one that fits the known facts very well. So the jury is still out on the existence of an actual MJ-12, but I think that, again, I think that it is a reasonable supposition to say that something like it did occur and does exist.
While rumors were spreading of alien technology, men in black and shadowy underground organizations, even more radical statements were being made, especially in the early 1980s. According to authors such as Milton William Cooper and David Icke, aliens had been captured and assimilated into the human race in a much more gruesome scenario, in which the role of the U.S. Army went far beyond simply recovering a crashed UFO.
This story of an alien conspiracy linked to the American government and multinational corporations is just another piece to the puzzle. Conspiracy theorists believe that throughout the world, especially in the United States, underground alien bases exist with 5 or 6 levels, literally teeming with aliens.
Et truffé de bases souterraines
Allegedly, there are thousands of aliens living in these bases, and their only goal is to use humans, raising them like cattle for reproductive research, or interbreeding races to create aliens capable of living among humans without being noticed. I recently met individuals who are convinced of this theory. These people seem quite normal and friendly on the surface, but then they get into a state of extreme paranoia when they become convinced that the enemy is everywhere. In their minds, walls have ears, and we are being watched at all times. And worst of all, there has been an infiltration from outer space, with the consent of governments and major financial institutions throughout the world.
Des gouvernements et de la grande puissance internationale financière.
This partnership between aliens and the military is supposedly being overseen by covert groups such as Illuminatis and the Freemasons, whose vast financial resources are being used to set up a new world order. Luckily, this belief is only supported by militants who use UFOs as an excuse for inventing the worst scenarios possible. To them, any official story is nothing more than a smokescreen designed to cover up horrible conspiracies, from the existence of aliens to flu epidemics spread intentionally by multinational pharmaceutical companies in cohort with governments throughout the world.
Since
the 1950s, there have always been groups insisting that the truth about UFOs is being kept from the public, that authorities know more than they are telling, that the military should be forced to release all of its more revealing files and so forth. Over the past couple of decades, these cries have gotten louder, especially in the United States, where they have been taken up by individuals close to the military, right-wing groups who tend to interpret everything in terms of a conspiracy theory. A few UFO experts are very interested in these conspiracy theories, which raises 2 points. Obviously, a debate surfaces over what is acceptable and what isn't in the case of a controversy. Also, is it necessary to associate yourself with these types of people and theories to be considered credible? Of course not. It's like saying that to be a politician in France, you have to join the National Front Party. That's not a very pleasant perspective.
Extremist views risk damaging what little credibility has been gained to date in the field of ufology. I think that some people are just too gung-ho. They reach a point of no return and gradually lose touch with reality.
If UFOs spotted over Area 51 are nothing more than remotely guided prototypes and not alien spacecraft, if Men in Black are more of a myth than a real censorship committee, and if the existence of a secret group like MJ-12 is still very uncertain, then where does that leave us in terms of a worldwide conspiracy theory? Somewhere between rationalists who claim that governments are transparent and flying saucer buffs who see every new official document as further proof of a large-scale conspiracy, there lies a middle ground which seems to make sense.
Many people feel that the government has been involved with a kind of a cover-up, but the idea is that we know an awful lot about things that happen in the American government and in the Canadian government, of course, and particularly with the American government, it's very difficult to keep secrets if they become political footballs. The Clinton-Lewinsky case, the innermost secrets of their personal relationships were revealed to the entire world. And all sorts of other secrets have come forward, and yet at the same time it is said that if the government is keeping a secret about UFOs, this is the best kept secret ever, because we will hear something about the subject once in a while and then nothing, and it's all sort of kept under wraps. Well, in my opinion, and I'm in a minority of researchers about this, I believe that if the government was studying this subject and had mounted an enormously huge study, which they would have to, if they knew that there was something to this subject, they would expend a tremendous amount of resources studying it. And it would be for a half a century that we would know this. We would, in fact, know this. There would be generations of scientists who work on the subject, and generations and generations and generations of politicians through 11 different presidential administrations who have worked on it. And it would be expanding almost in a cone-like effect, more and more people becoming involved with it, and we'd know it. Now, the problem with conspiracy theories is that there is no such thing as deniability. Every time the government says, no, it's not true, that becomes evidence of the cover-up. So it's not falsifiable, as they say. You can't ever prove it's not happening. Everything is in service of the conspiracy. So I caution my colleagues to be extremely careful with this.
Through my contacts and research, I have met quite a few UFO researchers throughout the world. For professional reasons, I have had to travel to several countries in the world. I had a chance to mix business with pleasure. And I'm still not convinced that there's a worldwide conspiracy by government leaders. I'm positive that over the past 50 or so years, a certain number of investigations, reports, and conclusions were kept under wraps. Of that, I'm sure. But I think that the governments were just doing their job. They were faced with unusual phenomena, and they investigated. That's normal. That's what they're supposed to do. It follows that if they were unable to come to any definite conclusions at the time, if they couldn't explain what was happening, then they wouldn't want to admit it. That's just normal as well. The same thing applies in other areas as well. When the French government wasted billions of taxpayer dollars, it didn't go around bragging. It tried to conceal the fact from the public. As far as UFOs are concerned, I think it's simply a case where the governments could not come to any definite conclusions about what they had on their hands, so they preferred not to talk about it. I positively do not believe in the conspiracy theory that little gray men or reptilian beings are trying to establish a new world order, using Illuminatis to hide the truth as they prepare to colonize the world.
I think there's evidence that at some level there's evasion. I'm not one to buy into a great organized conspiracy, but there's often uneven release policies between the various agencies. It's a touchy subject, and you know, you have to wonder, I'll tell you. I sometimes think, you know, when the excuse of national security is used, that it's not so much national security but national insecurity. Some of these people have huge budgets, and they're responsible for the penetration of our skies and defense systems and oceans, and they don't like to say, we don't know. The evidence is that we're not ready yet to face the fact that we may not be alone, or that we're not at the top of the pecking order. Look, 50% of the North American public feel we're not alone. 10% of this same North American public claim sightings and encounters. In fact, in Canada, the percentages are higher than in the U.S. It's a scary thought to think that we can't be sure of that, and these things move at will and whatever. And I can tell you that if you're an air traffic controller or an astronomer, UFOs are a reality. They may not be quick to say that they're a vehicle of extraterrestrial origin, but they're a problem, in fact, a life that have to be dealt with. UFOs are real. I don't know what they are, but they're there. And I'll tell you, sometimes the fear of the unknown encroaches on these people who are not really trained to deal with it, but if you receive a complaint, these people must respond and must deal with it. And, you know, they do the best they can sometimes.
In Canada, I haven't seen the government try to hide anything from me. I would go so far as to say that the government doesn't know anything. The military doesn't know anything. The police doesn't know anything either. Their silence proves that they don't know anything. Obviously, it could be interpreted as them hiding a big secret from us, but it's better for them to keep quiet because it's less disturbing to the population. It's somehow reassuring to believe that they're hiding something from us. We don't need to panic because the military are protecting the sky and the police are protecting the ground. So perhaps it's best that they keep quiet. I am convinced of of one thing, however. There are military officers who use their rank in much the same way that you might use the photocopier or the computer at the office to cut down on personal costs, sending faxes to Europe at the company's expense rather than having to pay for them yourself. Well, a high-ranking officer might just turn to a sergeant or a corporal and say, "Go to the St. Hubert military base. A UFO landed near there. Investigate the matter and write me up a report. Don't ask any questions because I'm a colonel and you're a corporal and you have no business asking questions. Take the jeep, go with one of your soldiers and check it out." When these two men get home, they might tell their wives that the army just sent them to investigate a UFO. And when women hear things from the military, they talk amongst themselves. It only takes two people for a rumor to start spreading. I think that at certain levels of the Army, not only here in Canada but elsewhere in the world as well, there are officers who use their rank and position for their own personal gain, to gather information. They aren't instructed to gather the information. They do it out of personal interest, which doesn't necessarily mean that the Army itself is hiding anything.
I tend not to believe that there's a widespread cover-up. If there is a cover-up, it probably is one more of ignorance. That is, the government says, maybe this UFO phenomenon is important. We don't understand it. We can't admit that publicly, so we, of course, will stay quiet about whatever we're doing. I've certainly heard stories, I've heard rumors, I've even talked to some people that have told me or others about secret projects and so forth. I've never come across any evidence that absolutely convinced me that there is a cover-up. I have come across evidence, though, that has shown that the U.S. government has done a miserable job at studying the phenomena and was greatly affected, for example, by the Cold War and the American policies, the government policies that basically said secrecy was critical in all aspects of the military and an industrial complex because of our Cold War with the Russians, Soviets. And this affected their attitudes toward UFOs because it turned out that UFO sightings might have been exploited for psychological reasons, possibly they thought by the Soviets and other things, so that what really should have been an open scientific study about UFOs was turned into something else by other factors, these social factors, I think, and political factors.
While it cannot be denied that governments are not always forthcoming when it comes to information about UFOs, there is also no proof of a vast cover-up operation. In a lot of cases, it's clear that information was kept secret due to the fear that reigned during the Cold War, the fear of a Russian invasion. We must be wary of wild rumors and documents whose meaning has been misconstrued. On the other hand, it's clear that for more than 50 years, there has been an ongoing campaign of disinformation where UFOs are concerned. The confusion has not been caused by shadowy secret services or elite branches of the government. No, in this game of true or false, the threat comes from within. After having promoted sensational stories over and over that could not be proven, the more zealous ufologists have muddled the subject of UFOs more than all government agencies combined. With total disregard for the facts, and often with a blazing desire to make their point, these militants have not hesitated to alter facts or completely ignore certain details to justify their cause, which just goes to show that when it comes to mixing up the truth, we do a good job of it ourselves. And with the invention of the internet, there's no doubt that the nightmare has already begun. To quote David Vincent, star of the fictional series, The Invaders. Discussions on the nature of UFOs remain extremely polarized between those who support the extraterrestrial theory and those who oppose it. This polarization is putting up a wall in debates and preventing the examination of further possibilities. In 1997, at the invitation of American billionaire Lawrence Rockefeller, well-known scientists gathered in Pocantico, New Jersey, to discuss UFOs. It was the first time since 1969 when the Air Force dropped its investigation into the matter that a panel of scientists had gotten together to discuss UFOs. Led by astrophysicist Peter Sturrock, these discussions brought the strange sightings to the academic forefront. Mark Roediger and John Schussler were among the scientists invited to the meeting.
The purpose of the meeting, it was designed by Peter Sturrock to do at least two things. One was to be a rebuttal, as it were, of the Condon Report. The Condon Report, of course, had come out in the late 1960s, and it had said that UFOs were not worth studying scientifically. And Sturrock had been very critical of that, and he had always hoped that he could get a group of scientists together to look at the phenomena objectively and reach a different conclusion, which he thought would be justified. So that was the first thing. The second was to present some of the latest UFO evidence to a panel of distinguished scientists to get their advice on the subject, to see how they would react to UFO evidence that the scientific community normally doesn't ever view.
The meeting was held in 1997 to allow the examination of physical evidence presented by people that do research in the UFO field to be examined by people outside the UFO field. And in both cases, these people were scientists receiving the information, presenting it, and then the scientists examining it. And they were selected based on people that could present the actual physical evidence, not stories, not wishful thinking, but evidence of things happening, real photographs, real videos, real medical effects, real ground trace effects, and that sort of thing. And in this field, there's quite a bit of that. It isn't often talked about, often discussed, and Dr. Sturrock thought it would be well to be able to expose this to an independent panel of people that had no interest or no knowledge of the subject, and get their opinion on what could be done or what should be done and how important it was. So that was the reason we met.
There wasn't anything amazing in the reports from the panel. I think the evidence was solid. Of course, I was there and presented some of it. I think it was evidence that the phenomenon is anomalous, but there wasn't anything so compelling that, you know, we would read the report and say, oh, why, this is astounding evidence. Why, you know, this really shows that this UFO phenomena is unearthly or alien or can't be explained by science absolutely. You know, no, it was just good, solid UFO evidence.
The scientists gathered at Pocantico concluded that the UFO problem was not simple and was certainly not the result of a general or single phenomenon. The report added that each unexplained observation presented the scientific community with an opportunity to make new discoveries through the study of these phenomena. However, out in the field, the main difficulty in studying UFOs is learning how to pinpoint what's relevant. Over the years, UFO circles have become such a melting pot for all phenomena that it takes a lot of serious research to find any significant proof within UFO reports. Between 1991 and 1994, Nick Pope was tasked by the British government to assess the pile of UFO sightings recorded by their Ministry of Defense. He therefore had ample opportunity to appraise the quality of the statements made by witnesses.
I think it's quite clear that 90 or 95% of UFO sightings are either misidentifications of something quite ordinary, but perhaps seen in unusual viewing conditions, or by a witness who is not familiar with the particular object or phenomenon. But there are these hardcore of cases, and there has been, right from the beginning of our official investigations in this. And this is as true for the Americans with Project Blue Book as it is for the British. There are these sightings that we can't explain. Good quality sightings. I'm not talking about cases where we have insufficient data. I'm talking about the sorts of cases where we have, say, police or military witnesses or pilots, say, who are seeing solid, structured craft. I'm talking about the cases where things are tracked on radar. I'm talking about cases where Air Force jets have been scrambled to try and intercept these things, and where perhaps we have good photographic or video evidence that has been properly analysed and enhanced. These sorts of cases. And when looking at these cases, I am quite favourably disposed to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, because when I've eliminated everything else, that seems to be a very real possibility. Can I prove it? No, I can't. We do not have proof. But in my mind, we do have good evidence.
UFO sightings are an undeniable fact, proven by the thousands of statements and recordings that have been submitted. These sightings happen. Explaining them is another thing. Making a broad statement that they're all false or they're all true based on a single explanation seems rather simplistic to me. The truth of the matter remains to be seen. It's true that most cases are false alarms. In our work, we have proven that most cases are the result of an honest error made by the observer, while now and then we see cases where the error was made intentionally or designed as a hoax.
In actual fact, what happens most of the time is that a person comes face to face with something that they do not understand. And they contact the police in the hopes of getting an answer to the mystery. Of all the sightings that are reported, practically none of them turns out to be a hoax. I would say maybe one hoax per 1,000 cases reported.
But for all of the other cases reported, there is no reason why there needs to be one single explanation. The proof is the fact that we're discovering new things every day, like sprites in the upper atmosphere, which we discovered a few years ago. They might explain some of the strange lights seen by aircraft in the sky. So there's certainly a whole gamut of explanation. The extraterrestrial theory is simply a projection based on a desire to believe, and for good reason. If we take a look at aviation files and radar data which seem to show objects displaying intelligent behavior, we're very tempted to believe just that. In actual fact, it's only one possible explanation.
Unfortunately, ufologists usually have nothing more to go on than statements made by witnesses. How valuable are these statements really? Rationalists tend to discard them under the pretext that a statement alone has no inherent value. We must exercise caution in considering these statements, but they are still a valuable source of information. If statements people make are truly of no value, then we might as well shut down the court system. Critics like to point out that when it comes to witnessing a UFO phenomenon, most people are not used to observing phenomena in the sky, even police officers and pilots.
Il y a un argument qu'on oppose tout le temps à l'histoire des ovnis, c'est effectivement le...
Arguments are always being raised against UFO stories, usually by rationalists, because there's a difference between scientists who work as researchers and rationalists who adamantly oppose any stories of UFOs. Their argument is that astronomers don't see UFOs. If all these things were flying around in the sky, then scientists, especially astronomers, would see them. The problem is that astronomers spot UFOs the same way as everyone else. We know that for a fact. Peter Sturrock, an astrophysicist from Stanford University, did a study back in 1977 which showed just that. Another study showed that 5% of UFO observers were astronomers, so they do see things too. But what does an astronomer actually do? He doesn't look at the whole sky, just like scientists don't look at nature. They look at their instruments. A telescope has a very small field of vision. If an astronomer were to see a UFO, it would only appear in passing like a satellite, a meteorite, or a bird. It would be very rare. They wouldn't have time to focus on the object. It would be gone before they knew it. When they see a meteorite fly by, they don't make anything of it. So astronomers do see strange things in the sky, but not usually while they're working. There's a genuine problem. When UFOs are discussed, some people say that they don't exist. The problem is not whether UFOs exist or not. The problem is that tons of arguments seem to be based on the idea that scientists observe nature, so they should be seeing UFOs. Scientists do not observe nature, they produce facts under laboratory conditions, very specific artificial conditions that do not correspond to the image of science portrayed in popular science magazines.
En lisant les magazines de vulgarisation.
Most UFO sightings have a perfectly rational explanation. They should not be considered of alien origin until all of the elements involved have been thoroughly analyzed. This analysis stage contains many hidden traps. Although they represent a very small percentage of objects reported, weather balloons can be mistaken for UFOs. Even seasoned observers like civil and military pilots have been fooled by these large silver spheres. Don Ledger, a Canadian civil pilot and co-author of Dark Object, took a keen interest in UFO sightings reported by his colleagues. He is familiar with the most common misinterpretations, like weather balloons, Venus, aircraft, auroras, meteorites, and billow clouds.
Normally, getting off track a bit here, usually large scientific balloons, and they are large. Some of these things are 300 feet across. They're filled with helium, and they're carrying scientific packages. We'll get a NOTAM as a pilot. You'll get a NOTAM with your boat every 3 months in the mail from Transport Canada, and it's NOTAM that this thing is going to be lifting off from a certain area, usually up north, where the air is more stable and where they're investigating anyway. And these things will go up 80, 90,000 feet. And as they go up, you've probably seen the older pictures of them. They look long and skinny, almost like a baseball bat, and then they start looking like an ice cream or a parachute. But by the time they get to altitude, they balloon right out because the air pressure is less up there. So they turn into this big, oval, shiny thing because of the makeup of the material, you know, the Kevlar or not Kevlar, but the mylar that makes these things up. And can carry up to 4 million cubic feet of helium in there. And they can drift around up in the upper atmospheres for days and days and days, reflecting sunlight. And people will report them, and that's really, they have every right to, because it's quite anomalous looking up there, and it's sparkling away. So they account for some UFO reports and so on.
There aren't that many weather balloons. They're launched in northern Quebec. Winds are predominantly from the west, so don't try to tell me that these supposed weather balloons are traveling from north to south. Okay, now that I've made that perfectly clear, let's drop this whole weather balloon business. Skeptics better come up with a better explanation than that, because according to them, weather balloons are everywhere. All UFOs are weather balloons. Observers have more chance of seeing an aircraft since planes are aluminum and maybe painted white, so when the sun is low on the horizon, it can reflect off the cabin. The wings can't be seen, just a fine white line in the sky, so since the object is far away and can't be heard, it can be mistaken for a UFO. Venus is also a possibility. Most people in Quebec travel between Montreal and Quebec City, so they travel east-west on highways 10, 20, and 40, which means they may spot Venus setting in the west. If you see Venus setting in the north, call me, because it isn't Venus. Of all the planets, Venus is the one that is most often mistaken for a UFO. So what I'm saying is that people may be mistaking aircraft and planets for UFOs. That's true, but it's time they stop trying to tell us that people are seeing weather balloons.
In the spring of 2002, a Montreal businessman filmed a curious sight in the sky. It was very early in the morning, and the object showed up clearly against the morning sky. Upon analysis, it was discovered that the object was nothing more than a mail plane arriving at the local airport. At times, the source of confusion is much more simple. Officer Nelson Jean with the Quebec Provincial Police recalls a UFO sighting recorded at his station.
At the time, we were responsible for covering Montérégie, Montreal, Laval, the Laurentians, and Lanaudière. As I recall, it happened near Saint-Julie. People called to report colored lights in the sky. When our police officers arrived at the scene, they traced the lights back to a dance club. Someone was either accidentally or intentionally projecting laser beams into the sky, which was leading people in the area to think that they were seeing something from outer space, perhaps a UFO or a signal from extraterrestrials.
Other than laser beam projectors, aircraft, and weather balloons, we also need to consider objects entering Earth's atmosphere. Orbital debris, which is becoming more and more common. A few years ago, during a similar incident over France, the state police were inundated with calls throughout the country from citizens wishing to report a UFO sighting. At the time, Jean-Jacques Velasco was already heading up the French group CIPRA, which tracks objects entering Earth's atmosphere. It is an agency working for the French National Space Research Center, otherwise known as CNES.
We've noticed that these days, a lot of sightings result from debris falling from objects in orbit. This was the case on November 5th, 1990, when we witnessed an amazing display of debris from a Russian rocket. The debris was scattered throughout the skies over Europe, particularly over France.
Films and photographs can be useful tools to ufologists as they try to make heads or tails out of a UFO sighting. But once again, a visual aid in itself does not constitute proof that UFOs are alien in origin. This is true even more so now that new computer technologies allow amateurs to fake photos that look as professional as anything produced in Hollywood.
Well, as you know, I'm quite familiar with the field of photography since I worked as an expert in this area when I was with CNES. I came to the conclusion that it is one of the most disappointing aspects of UFO cases. Why do I think that? Well, first of all, it's the element that evokes the most emotional response and most expectations from the public. We often hear people say, if only we had a good picture of this, we could check into it further. In actual fact, nothing is further from being solid proof than a single photo on its own. That was true even 15 or 20 years ago. Back then, I received funding to study all the tricks involved in photo analysis. We noticed that some people were very clever at faking photos. Nowadays, with computer technology, anyone can use commercial software to touch up photos. I've had a bet for 10 years that no one can produce a photo able to withstand photo analysis tests. There are two types of photographs of so-called UFOs. There are the cases where the witnesses are in a state of panic over something that they saw, and there's little information available. These pictures are typically a small white light against a dark background, or if taken during the day, the object appears as a small dot in the sky, as was the case in Vret, France a few years ago, when an object was photographed against a clear blue sky. Even using the most powerful tools possible, the information extracted is minimal. Then there are the photos for which more information is provided. At the other extreme, you have fake photos. They don't pop up as often as you might think, but they still seem to be profitable in some countries. When I traveled in certain southern countries, I noticed that books were being sold with fake photos in them. Generally, they're pretty easy to spot. Then there's a majority of cases where an honest error is made. This happens when a person sees something that appears strange to them, and they take a picture of it only to discover later that it was simply the aurora borealis or some other uneventful occurrence. There are also cases where something odd happens in the camera when a picture is taken. Cases of optical phenomena or cases where something is on the film. I once saw a photo that had me stumped for the longest time until I analyzed the film under a microscope. As far as misinterpretations go with respect to photos or home movies, a lot of people mistake reflections for UFOs. Many people use small camcorders these days, which is great for us UFO researchers, since these films provide us with good visual material to analyze. I'll give you a quick trick for figuring out whether or not your photo or film has a reflection on it. You just need to draw an X across your photo. Take a ruler and draw a light line with a pencil from one corner up to the opposite corner. Then do the same with the other two corners. This will give you the center of your picture. If the brightest object in your photo is a reflection, then it will cross the center and keep on going an equal distance in the opposite direction. The reflection can't be anywhere else. The angle of reflection is equal to the angle of incidence. This is a basic law of physics. People often take pictures through a window or a glass pane, and cameras Cars also have a protective lens covering, which can create reflections when a picture is being taken, like of a street light or of distant car lights. The photographer doesn't see the sources in his reduced field of vision. A car passes by, shines on the lens, and a small lens-shaped reflection appears on the photo. Before you call the press to say that you've just photographed a flying saucer, you should double-check to make sure that there are no reflections in your picture. Only then should you consider that perhaps there really was an object in the sky. If there was an object, then it's time for what I refer to as the investigative process, noting the color of the object and calculating distances and so forth, to determine the size and possibly the weight of the object.
At times, the so-called UFO is nothing more than an unidentified optical object. In the early 1990s, there were several sightings of discs with scalloped edges, vaguely reminiscent of the symbol used by the comic book hero Batman. According to the reports, these bat-shaped discs first began to appear over Belgium, before spreading to Spain and then the United States. Unfortunately for mystery lovers, there was nothing exciting behind these UFOs. The image was nothing more than a bright object, such as the moon or a streetlight, filmed out of focus, due to the focus ring on camcorders that had just come out on the market at the time. Speaking of images, Earth is now constantly monitored by a network of satellites. Each day, these spies in the sky take dozens of pictures of the Earth. Why aren't there any satellite images of UFOs?
Another mistake that ufologists often make with respect to satellite images is that they think if UFOs are flying around the Earth, we should see one appear on the satellite image now and then. When they say that, they obviously do not realize that remote sensing satellites circle Earth every 90 minutes at an altitude of 500 to 600 miles. If we look at satellite images, all we see is a bunch of tiny dots on a huge surface. Even if an army of 100 huge UFOs landed on Earth within the space of a few hours, it is highly unlikely that they would be detected by any of the dozens of satellites hovering over Earth.
As we try to identify the unknown, some UFOs defy explanation. At least, it would seem so at first glance. However, just because we can't correctly label an object doesn't mean we should jump to the conclusion that we're being invaded by aliens. Remember, the term UFO does not necessarily mean an interplanetary craft. Jean-Pierre Farabeau was a research engineer working at a physics lab within France's Polytechnical Institute. A few years ago, he wrote a book about unidentified flying weapons.
One possible explanation for UFOs is that they are secret military aircraft. A historian from the CIA even wrote a report claiming that most unexplained UFOs could be attributed to flights by an aircraft referred to as the U-2.
Pouvait s'expliquer par les vols d'un avion qui s'appelle le U-2.
Well, it's true that some of the U-2's flight plans did coincide with UFO sightings. But in my opinion, this happened in a very small percentage of cases. There's also the fact that the U-2 was flown for the first time in 1955, whereas UFO sightings began to be reported regularly as of 1947. So the U-2 could certainly be used to explain some of the sightings, especially since it flies at a very high altitude. And it has what you might call a halo effect. Although it is shaped like a glider, glare from the sun's rays may cause it to look circular instead. The fact remains that it appeared in the sky too late to explain the first 8 years of UFO sightings. And there's still the fact that only a few of the U-2's flights correspond to UFO sightings. There were other aircraft built after the U-2 that could have been mistaken for UFOs due to their speed and high flying altitude. They were called Blackbirds. 2 different aircraft were built that closely resembled each other: the CIA's A-12 and the Air Force's SR-71. But once again, the A-12 was flown for the first time in 1962, so it could not account for any sightings before that time. Naturally, it could account for some of the sightings reported since then.
While engineers at the Lockheed Aviation Corporation were designing the U-2 spy plane, officials in charge of technical development within the U.S. Air Force were already conceiving of an even more ambitious project, named Project Silverbug. Their goal was to build a circular craft capable of vertical liftoff and able to fly at an altitude of 80,000 feet and a speed of Mach 3, or 3 times the speed of sound. Development of Project Silverbug was assigned to engineers at the Canadian firm Avro, which had designed the lightweight Arrow CF-105.
The Avro car was an engineering study by the same company that produced the Arrow, the infamous aircraft that was built by the Canadian government and then eventually cancelled. In fact, there is a popular movie about it quite recently starring Dan Aykroyd. At the same time they were producing this jet aircraft, they were producing a circular vehicle that was said to be able to rise up on its own power and fly through the air. A number of other devices like this had been produced, but this was the Canadian government's own attempts. Curiously, midway through the development, it too was cancelled.
Unable to rise more than a couple of feet off the ground, the Avro car was a failure. Its instability made it dangerous to fly. In 1961, Project Silverbug was terminated, and one of the only 2 models built is now installed on a pedestal in front of the U.S. Army Transport School in Virginia. Could UFO tales have been inspired by test flights of the Avro car or other secret prototypes with an unusual aerodynamic shape, like the YB-49, or perhaps the V-173, nicknamed the Flying Pancake? Or in more recent years, perhaps UFO observers spotted the B-2 stealth bomber or the F-117A fighter, both of which have an unusual shape. According to rumors, recent UFO sightings could be flights of a secret prototype being built in the legendary Area 51, a triangular craft known by the code name Aurora.
Rumors that the Aurora exists have been spread by a magazine that is generally quite serious in nature, the Aviation Week in Space Technology. An article was published in 1990 in which they stated that there had been more than 40 sightings or telephone confirmations by sources within the military, proving the existence of this aircraft, capable of flying at incredible speeds such as Mach 5 to Mach 8, at extraordinary altitudes, much higher than the blackbirds could fly.
Extraordinaire, encore bien plus haut que les blackbirds. On en a beaucoup parlé.
I heard a lot about this aircraft. Around 1991, and for a year or 2 afterwards, we heard reports of what were referred to as skyquakes. They were like earthquakes, but they came from the sky. They came from the Pacific coast over California and headed in the direction of Area 51. They would occur every Thursday morning like clockwork. This was rather odd behavior for either a natural phenomenon or extraterrestrial beings. We're not sure why Thursday morning was so important to them. So it seemed to be pretty much of an established fact that it existed, and then we never heard anything more about it. The U.S. Department of Defense formally denied that it existed. We're under the impression that there are sightings of man-made crafts that we should normally be able to explain, but they must be secret military craft, and that's why we can't explain them. But even those don't explain all of the sightings.
There are other phenomena which might help to explain several UFO reports, but they are more difficult to zero in on. There is a whole field of natural phenomena which are mentioned now and then in scientific papers, but remain mysterious and unexplained. Such is the case for seismic lights, or earthquake lights, as they are sometimes called, lights created by earthquakes. Bertrand Saint-Laurent has taken an interest in this strange phenomenon.
A few UFO reports, and I mean just a few, a very low percentage, can be explained by earthquake lights. But I mean real earthquake lights. As far as I'm concerned, to be earthquake lights, they have to occur during an earthquake or immediately before or after it. There also needs to be a link with tectonic strain. Before an earthquake occurs, there may be a period of months or years during which major forces are at work under the Earth's surface at particular locations. And as this stress builds, it can produce what I call tectonic lights, what others refer to as earth lights.
Well, actually, the interest in luminous phenomena or UFO reports began with really an empirical approach. We were looking at we meaning Ghislaine Lafreniere and I, were looking at the relationship between unusual phenomena, balls of light, unusual animals, and we tried to find out what could be related to them, and we found that earthquakes tend to occur in the same areas. So, as any science would, we pursued that and found out that, sure enough, luminous phenomena throughout the centuries have preceded increases in earthquake activity. Let me address UFO phenomena, which are the balls of light, the unusual colors of lights that inundate, or I should say inundate one's perceptual field, but they show an oscillation. They often look like they're turning, and basically different temperatures reflect different wavelengths and different colors. Those are physical phenomena generated by the Earth itself. Strain within the Earth, stress within the Earth, before earthquakes generate these balls of light. And we know that's correct because in any given area, there's an increase in luminous phenomena before earthquakes occur. The majority of luminous phenomena are tied to imminent earthquake activity, stress and strain within the Earth. And the reason we know that is that in areas where there's a buildup of water, for example in reservoirs, or when people pump water into an area, for example to bury hazardous fluids, there's increases in earthquakes locally and also an increase in luminous phenomena. A very small number of luminous phenomena are associated with people having the experience of contact with an alien or contact with some other entity.
We knew that in order to be seeing what we were seeing, there had to be a very strongly charged electric field producing these luminous displays in the sky. We knew that. Since the 1960s and 1970s, scientists have been trying to discover what causes these earth lights to appear in the sky. They made some discoveries and came up with a few theories. Some scientists researched the lights in a laboratory setting, but what they often found was that their theories only partially explained what was being observed. There were gaps in their theories, but that doesn't matter. That's just normal. After all, they were just starting to research the phenomenon.
Well, one thing we do know is that tectonic strain building up before an earthquake, is distributed along earthquake faults, very often along riverbeds or creek beds, on the top of hills, and a variety of unusual phenomena can be generated. Balls of light are simply one. Also, ultrasound can be generated, which very often rats or dogs can hear. Sometimes odd smells are generated. Sometimes if you have a Peltier phenomena, you get a decrease in temperature locally, or sometimes an increase in spontaneous fires. If you happen to be unfortunate enough to walk through these fields, it's going to stimulate your brain directly. And very often, people experience a haunt. And in our research, we find that wherever you have luminous phenomena showing up, so-called UFO flap, you also have an increase of all kinds of other parapsychological phenomena. Haunts, poltergeist reports, basically strange things in general become more frequent, including mundane things like more light bulbs burned out, more alternators in your cars burned out, cars not starting, more anomalous behavior by humans, for example, more suicidal behaviors from protracted depression. These things often occur in clusters.
Even though research into Earth lights is still in its early stages, some scientists are beginning to find possible explanations. One of these scientists is Friedemann Freund, professor of physics at San Jose State University in California.
Purely by accident, I recently came across a scientist who works at San Jose State University in California. He also works for the NASA Ames Research Center. He proposed a theory and created a model to explain how these lights were being produced. I found his theory interesting because it also explained why earthquake lights sometimes do not occur, since we have observed that they don't occur with every earthquake. What is interesting about his theory is that it is based on a discovery that he made several years ago. Below the Earth's surface, among igneous rocks, which form most of the Earth's crust, can be found something called charge carriers. I won't explain the chemistry behind it since it's pretty complicated. So he discovered these charge carriers, which he called positive hole pairs. When there is not much tectonic strain, these charge carriers lie dormant in the rock. On the other hand, when the tectonic strain builds to the point where an earthquake is about to occur, these charge carriers become quite mobile. In his laboratory, Freund calculated that these charge carriers could move as fast as 1,000 feet per second. That's pretty fast. So around the time of an earthquake, we have these charge carriers moving about, spreading throughout the Earth's crust. As these charges move, by definition, each one is a current. In electronics, we call it a hole current. It has a positive charge due to a lack of electrons. When these mobile charges hit the Earth's surface, they generate electromagnetic waves of various wavelengths. They then create a strong electric field at the Earth's surface. Freund calculated that in an ideal setting, for instance at the top of a mountain, the charge could get as high as 1 million volts per centimeter. That's a pretty powerful electric field. Once this electric field is created, it puts a strain on the air, which is normally an insulator. And the air changes from an insulator to a conductor and produces luminous displays in the sky.
One of the conclusions that scientists arrived at during the Pocantico meetings in 1997 was that UFO sightings do not boil down to one single phenomenon. Research by Dr. Michael Persinger at Laurentian University in Sudbury shows that the assessment of these sightings goes beyond a mere "I believe in UFOs" or "I don't believe in UFOs."
One of the lessons we learn in science is that phenomenon such as UFOs, luminous phenomena, that is an over-inclusive label. I'll give you an example. In the late 1800s, the word vapors was used to describe pneumonia, emphysema, tuberculosis, the common cold, and flu as well as cancer. They were all called the vapors because they influenced breathing. Now imagine what would have happened if penicillin was developed then and you gave it to people with vapors. Well, only those with pneumonia would have been beneficial, and people would have dismissed penicillin because it did not treat vapors. The problem is the label. It's over-inclusive. And the same thing with the UFO label. It over-includes a lot of strange phenomena. Most of them have very clear natural bases that we know about now, but there's still others we have to be open-minded about. And just because we're open-minded doesn't mean it's never measurable, which means we ultimately can measure it. In the perspective of science, anything is probable. And if we have a phenomenon such as UFOs, or basically luminous phenomena, that's a more appropriate way to describe them, because UFOs is a pejorative label with all kinds of negative connotations. Odd luminous events. Most of them we know from our data analysis, more than 80% are clearly tied to tectonic strain. We're talking about the real ones now, not the misperceptions. Of the remaining 20%, it's hard to tell what the actual natural forces are. And the possibility that there are other phenomena yet to be discovered, including other intelligences, we still must be open-minded to that possibility.
In general, the scientific community is not interested in UFOs. Why? Obviously, there is the ever-present funding problem. What self-respecting financial institution would put its credibility on the line by financing research into UFOs? No funding, no research. But there is a worse problem: prejudice. To most scientists, the logic is quite simple. If UFOs were real, then there would have to be extraterrestrial spaceships. And since interstellar travel is not possible, UFO reports cannot be true. In all research, observation must take precedence over theory. As Robert Leighton, one of the pioneers of modern physics, once said, "If something happens, it's because it's possible for it to happen." But of all the strange cases that defy explanation, how many are really prototypes of secret military aircraft, and how many are really due to natural phenomena as yet unknown? Could the other cases really be visitors from outer space? For now, it's impossible to say for sure. If there's one thing that holds true in the police world, it's that if you want to solve a problem, you must take an interest in it.
We noticed that the science community turned its back on the Pocantico report. We weren't too surprised, since they've always had that attitude where this subject is concerned. I recently did an audit on the CNES Research Center, and along the way I met some prominent scientists from the technical field. I won't name any names, but I was stupefied by what some of them had to say. In their minds, the only things that truly exist in the field of science are things that can be created in a laboratory setting. If the great minds of science in all countries think like this, then we're not about to make much headway in the science of observation. The problem with UFOs is that we don't see them in abundance. We can say the same thing about scientific facts. Who has ever seen a scientific fact? If anyone ever has, I'd like to meet them. It's impossible. Scientific facts are charts, diagrams, and things you read about in magazines. You never hear anyone say, "Look, I just saw a scientific fact." If we take a cloud, for instance, sure, it's a scientific fact, but only because it's been studied. Scientific facts do not appear out of thin air. Apples falling from trees were used to make jam long before they became associated with the law of gravity. Newton had to invent the law of gravity first. By the way, the apple story never even happened. So we have a problem. To become a scientific fact, it must first be placed in the proper context. So the question is, what can we do with these UFO reports to capture the interest of scientists? We need to word the problem differently. Just because it's worded in terms of UFOs doesn't mean that the problem should be discarded completely with the claim that UFOs don't exist. That's simply not reasonable.
Since the early 1980s, throughout the world, hundreds of mysterious shapes have appeared in crop fields. Some people think that these are merely elaborate hoaxes, while others claim that they reveal a secret message, a desire by other life forms to communicate with us. Supposedly, plants gathered from some of these crop circles had significant changes in their DNA structure. Some people have even succeeded in filming the creation of one of these extraordinary shapes. If these films are real, then the crop circle phenomenon deserves a place of honor in the field of extraterrestrial activity. Over the years, the UFO phenomenon has become such a large forum that we find hundreds of cases where the link with unidentified flying objects is more intellectual than factual. Such is the case for the cryptids, strange creatures, whose appearance in our world has been recorded in incredible reports. In 1990, Puerto Rico became the hunting ground for a predator that seemed to spring right out of a Lovecraft novel. The creatures primarily attacked small livestock, sheep, chickens, and goats. The dead bodies were drained of all blood. Hence the creatures were dubbed the chupacabras, which literally means goat sucker. Witnesses report that the 5-foot-tall creatures looked like gargoyles, with bat-like wings, sharp claws, and huge, bright red eyes.
Well, the chupacabras really is, if, you know, whatever reality it has, which is very questionable, is, but it's certainly more in the area of Forteana, really, or cryptozoology than UFO. There is no direct connection to UFOs. It basically is supposed to be some creature of some kind. In fact, you do find similar type of creatures in the Fortean literature, for instance, the Jersey Devil, right near this area at the turn of the 20th century. You look at the drawings of the Jersey Devil, almost identical to the chupacabras. And it's supposed to be a very vicious creature that, you know, chupacabras means goat sucker, right? And supposedly it attacks these animals and drinks their blood. It started in Puerto Rico a few years ago. Before that, even though if you go back to the literature in Puerto Rico, you do find in the 1970s, there was a serious man who was the founder of ufology in Puerto Rico, Lamarche, Sebastián Romieu Lamarche, and he was an architect, well-educated man. The foreword was written by Hynek. And he discusses many cases in the Caribbean. And among other things, he does talk about a wave that took place in Puerto Rico in the 70s of an entity that was known as the Vampire of Mocha. And the Vampire of Mocha is really the chupacabras, except that it's a little bit more sober, the drawing. You know, it doesn't have as many fancy things. But if you look at the drawings, it's obviously the same creature. So something appears to be happening there anyway. But this whole thing got really carried away, and you had this incredible sociological wave, which you can trace it as it goes south. It starts in Puerto Rico, where it gets incredible promotion. Then it moves to Mexico, where again, thanks to people like Jaime Maussan and others, it gets incredible publicity. And then it starts moving south. And in Chile, it reached really grotesque proportions, where they claimed that there was a nest of chupacabras, and this was all in like sensationalist websites on the internet, from Chilean groups and also from Chilean sensationalist newspapers, and they claimed the Chilean Air Force did a bombing, and they bombed the nest of the chupacabras.
I have spoken to many witnesses throughout Puerto Rico. For a number of years running, I've conducted investigations there. I've spoken to people who've seen this creature, which has been witnessed by dozens of witnesses in some cases at the same time. It's able to fly, it's landed on their roofs and terrorized them. I think the most compelling witness I spoke to was a police officer of the Puerto Rican police who caught one of these creatures trying to kill his dog. And he shot at it point-blank range with a .357 Magnum with a split-end bullet. And those bullets do a lot of damage. It did not kill the chupacabras, but it certainly spoiled its day. So, and it left a lot of blood, and the blood samples were taken away by forensic experts with the Puerto Rican police. And I've had a lot of help in Puerto Rico by civil defense officials who led me to that policeman. So, as far as I'm concerned, this creature is real. I don't know where it comes from or what its purpose is, but it seems to be a blood gatherer. It seems its essential purpose is to gather blood and other internal substances from our terrestrial animals.
So that's basically, in brief words, I can tell you about the chupacabras. I think there is something, if you look at Vampiro de Mocha, and also in Puerto Rico initially, there was some veterinarian reports, you know. But beyond the original reports, the problem of the chupacabra wave is as it moves southwards, there was absolutely no forensic analysis. It was all media, eyewitnesses, in some cases eyewitnesses, I mean, there were dead chickens and things like that, but, you know, it could be explained in many various predators and so on, or perhaps not. But the problem is that they were not proper forensic. And when it comes to cattle mutilations or mutilations of animals of any kind, you know, then you absolutely need forensic analysis of the carcass. Otherwise, you're not talking of serious research.
Towards the end of the 1990s, as the chupacabras were becoming more and more well known in UFO circles, although their link to UFOs was mostly speculation, another creature appeared on the scene. This new creature appeared in Varginha, a small village in Minas Gerais, about 180 miles north of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
I think one of the most important cases of the 1990s is that involving the creatures which were captured by fire department and military army officials in Varginha, Brazil, on January 1996. This has got a tremendous amount of witness testimony. Not only that, but many of the military witnesses have come forward and allowed their names to be used. Some of the medical personnel who handled the creature have come forward. It started one day in January 1996, and three witnesses actually saw a creature, a strange creature, cowering, apparently wounded or something, a very bizarre looking creature. Eventually, to cut a long story short, fire department officials came along, the army came along with nets to capture the creature. Another creature was captured elsewhere. They were taken away by the army to one hospital and then another hospital, and they were both given physical examination. One creature died and was autopsied, and the autopsy was conducted by Dr. Badan Palhares. Apparently, he has not allowed his name to be used, but I'm convinced that he was the actual person who conducted that autopsy, and details have been provided. There are books published in Brazil on the subject, and I published details in Unearthly Disclosure. An extraordinary case, really. You might refer to it as a Brazilian Roswell, if you like, but the difference is that it happened not long ago, and there are people prepared to come forward and talk about it. The official explanation is that it was caused by dwarfs, a pregnant dwarf couple and another dwarf who was shielding himself from the rain. So, you know, to me, this official explanation by the Brazilian army is absolutely ludicrous.
Now, with regards to Varginha case, this happened, if memory serves me, around 1996. And again, is a case which, if you look at the raw report, the original report, it could be categorized as a close encounter of the third kind. Really, there were these three girls from a poor neighborhood of this city in Brazil called Varginha who encountered this creature. But somehow, and that case might be true. These three girls, you know, I mean, John Mack and many people later interviewed the girls, and everybody was convinced that they were sincere. They went in panic. They saw this creature, which was naked, you know, and running around and so on. But then is when the story starts getting fantastic. So they call the firemen, and they go there, and they capture this so-called alien with nets and sticks. This is the most underdeveloped alien that I've never seen in the history of ufology. You know, he runs naked, he gets captured with nets, he has no machinery, no uniform, no nothing. So even if something was captured, I believe it belongs really more to the category of cryptozoology. But because Roswell and Area 51 and all these myths were getting enormous exposure in the 90s, you start having Roswell cases in practically in every country. I remember there was a Roswell in Poland, even in Chile they came up with a Roswell and so on, but most of these were unsuccessful. But Varginha became very successful. And immediately from this C3 of the three girls, next you have a crash saucer with alien autopsies, with American Air Force, you know, the whole package. But none of this part has been well documented to my knowledge. For some reason, I think the Brazilian ufologists were very eager to have their own craft saucer, and they really jumped the gun.
It seemed there was a whole zoo of nightmarish creatures wandering the earth, like the chupacabras and the Varchinha monster. But what about the other oddities like Mothman, the Flatwood monster, and the Dover demon? The problem with all of the stories about unknown creatures is that they are supported by little or no physical proof. They form a series of more or less credible tales and reports. Unfortunately, there are no official documents confirming or denying the existence of these creatures. Neither are there photographs or credible films showing proof of their existence. When the Chupacabras attacks first began, Dr. Carlos Soto, a Puerto Rican veterinarian, confirmed that the livestock had been killed by a strange animal that was not a known local predator. Unfortunately, these analyses were never used in a subsequent investigation. For the time being, these creatures belong to the Zoo of Oddities. Each year, hundreds of livestock are mutilated in both the United States and Canada, and in some European countries as well. Obviously, most of these deaths are blamed on wolves, coyotes, and even birds of prey, such as buzzards. But behind the obvious cases, there are a series of mutilations that are not so easily explained. In some cases, animal parts have been removed, such as the anus, the reproductive organs, the eyes and the ears, and this appears to have been done with surgical precision. In several cases, especially those involving cattle, the animals were literally drained of their blood. These mutilations are so intriguing that some people are quick to blame them on extraterrestrials.
The whole animal mutilation phenomenon is very disturbing, and I've seen some very in-depth work that's been done, for example, by the National Institute for Discovery Science in America, with detailed forensic reports showing purportedly unusual cuts, perhaps made by a high heat source, such as a laser. There's apparently been a lack of predation with the carcasses, and some suggestion that the bodies have been exsanguinated. What all this means, I don't know. During my 3 years of work on the UFO mystery, I made contact with somebody in our Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food to see whether we were having cases like that here in Britain. There were a few suspicious deaths, but I believe that these were generally being put down to perhaps another mystery, the mystery of the big cats supposedly running wild in Britain. Lynxes, panthers, even lions, sometimes seen in the wild. And so any suspicious deaths were being put down to these factors, or indeed to just ordinary attacks by dogs. So this was never looked into as much as I would have liked. But it's an intriguing mystery. I don't know.
I personally believe that these animal mutilations are a very important matter and quite disturbing, like UFOs. It's been going on for a long time now, since the first case was reported in 1967, when a small horse was mutilated. There was an increase in this type of phenomena during the 1970s, with 1975 being a particularly rough year. Local authorities demanded an investigation. The FBI was not interested in investigating the matter and turned it over to a retired investigator named Ramo, who turned in a report stating that it was being done by birds of prey. But if we examine the matter more closely, we can see that his conclusions don't hold water, since some of the mutilations were extremely bizarre, as if the cuts were made with a laser. In one case, the skin was cut open along the entire length of the head. Birds of prey are not capable of doing that.
Et il y a de très très nombreux cas.
Endless cases have been piling up, and rural residents are concerned.
Ça s'est passé surtout aux États-Unis, mais
The occurrences have been primarily in the United States, but there have also been cases reported in Canada and in Europe, particularly Northern Europe, places like Scandinavia and Great Britain.
mutilations en Argentine.
This year there was quite a wave of mutilations in Argentina. Authorities tried to blame them on mice, but that explanation is far from credible and has met with serious protest from regional experts.
Et elle est violemment contestée par les experts régionaux.
One theory is that they're actually secret military
Il
experiments.
a été avancé par certains suggérait que c'était des expériences militaires secrètes.
I don't believe this explanation either. Why not? Because if the military had wanted to conduct secret studies, it would not have staged such frightening scenes for the public to discover.
Besoin de faire des mises en scène
It would have been much more discreet.
effrayantes, effrayer la population. Ils feraient ça discrètement, ils achèteraient les
It would have procured the animals here and there and would have done the experiments discreetly in the lab.
conspirationnistes.
There's also a conspiracy theory claiming that these mutilations are done intentionally by the military to make people afraid of aliens.
Par des militaires qui veulent que les gens aient peur des extraterrestres.
Why? According to conspiracy theorists, it's because the military wants to exploit this fear to gain power, to gain greater control over operations and over the population.
Mais avoir un plus grand contrôle sur les opérations, sur la population. Bon, moi,
I'm not totally convinced by this line of reasoning.
ce genre de raisonnement.
The occurrences seem to be closely tied in with UFO sightings in the region. So unfortunately, I think that the matter is linked with UFOs,
Donc,
which would make it a more disturbing side of the whole UFO phenomena.
c'est quand même inquiétant du dossier.
Unfortunately, despite its popularity, there is not much to support the alien theory. Some authors attempted to establish a correlation between the discovery of a mutilated cow and a UFO sighting reported in that area. But that's where the correlation ends between UFOs and mutilated animals. In fact, these coincidences, and there is no reason to believe that they are anything but that, occur quite seldom. If we consider the fact that animal mutilations date back to the late 1960s. Of all the theories proposed to explain the animal mutilations, the one involving extraterrestrials is the most unlikely and least documented.
I have personally only examined 2 or 3 cases myself, and I am puzzled. The ranchers and owners of the carcasses were very confounded by what they had seen. They did not have an explanation as to what had caused the death or the decay of their cattle. I'm not a veterinary pathologist, so I'd have to defer to one, and when I talked with veterinary pathologists in Canada about what was being reported, it was their opinion that what was being seen and found were simply carcasses caused by natural decay, natural deaths, and perhaps some deaths by predators. They did not see a body of evidence. Yet, today, there's an excellent researcher by the name of Fern Belzile in Alberta, who is a rancher of some repute and a very good investigator, a rancher who knows what happens to cattle. And he has seen many, many unusual carcasses and is convinced that there is something more to the cattle mutilation phenomenon than simply predators or natural deaths. As for myself, I still do not see a connection with UFOs, but I believe it's an interesting phenomenon that is probably worthy of study, but I would like to see more veterinary pathologists get involved, because at this point most of the people investigating cattle mutilations are UFO researchers without a background in veterinary pathology, and it is those people whose expertise I believe would have the ultimate authority.
Another theory proposes that it is the work of small groups making animal sacrifices, but this theory must be rejected. In general, satanic cults that make animal sacrifices tend to use small animals like cats, dogs, and goats. If the mutilations are being done by humans, we have to look elsewhere, not in these cults. Could it be part of a vast secret operation orchestrated by authorities? To even give this theory a second thought, we would have to entertain several speculations. For the purpose of this exercise, let's imagine that agents working for a covert branch of the government are performing complex tests to study the behavior of certain gases to prepare for future chemical or germ warfare. These gases would be dumped into the air. Then, a few days later, a commando of specially trained forces would show up to remove skin samples from livestock. This scenario, which borders on paranoia, may not be as wild as it appears. We recently obtained secret documents from the archives of the FBI, which state that some of the livestock were found with high doses of the insecticide atropine in their blood, which is a tranquilizing drug. Another report suggested that these mutilations were being done to test the effects of vitamin B12 or other toxins in the lymph node system. As compromising as this speculation may seem, the documents appear to point in one direction. Interestingly, in its official report released to the press in 1980, the FBI, who had been contacted by the governor of New Mexico to examine the mutilation problem, concluded that they were essentially the work of predators. There was no mention of toxic substances found in some of the dead animals. But if it was done by agents working for the government, why would they be using farmers' livestock? Wouldn't it be more discreet for them to use government property and animals? These are a few of the questions that remain unanswered at this time. Questions such as these will no doubt continue to generate wild conspiracy theories. In the early 1980s, a new odd phenomenon captured the interest of UFO groups: crop circles. At first, they were described as circles of different sizes, found early in the morning in fields of growing crops. The plants had been flattened without the stalks having been broken. Some claimed that this was proof that they were not a hoax. Oddly enough, the phenomenon seemed to be happening only in southern England. Then, while scientists were trying to come up with models to explain how mini tornadoes could produce such an effect, the crop circle phenomenon took on a whole new dimension. Instead of circles, fields would be marked with geometric shapes that became more complex over time. It could no longer be discounted as a natural phenomenon. Whatever was behind these shapes, it obviously displayed a great ability for transformation and a high level of intelligence. In 1991, while some people were seeking a secret message behind these shapes, a news item was released that shocked the world. Two retirees, Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley, said that they were the ones who had started the crop circles. They had supposedly made their first crop circles in the late 1970s using a board attached to a rope. The press had not mentioned it at the time. Once several crop circles were created, the media became interested and spread the news. As is often the case with this type of story, Doug and Dave's confession did not convince the entire world. What's more, those who believed that there was a higher meaning to the crop circles were quick to point out that the two retirees were paid close to $2,000 for their scoop.
One of the sort of new faces of the UFO phenomenon in the 1980s onwards was the emergence of crop circles, particularly around the slopes and the hills of the southern England, around Warminster indeed, where the British UFO stories were born virtually. And of course they were then reported in other countries, and indeed right across the world they've been reported. It's a very popular phenomenon. It's actually made its first movie in Signs recently and so on, and it has been quite well investigated. I've spent 2 or 3 years investigating crop circles all over southern England and so on, and indeed in Sweden when I was working in Sweden with a Swedish researcher. What I think is important about crop circles is that there was a belief that a crop circle could not form naturally. And there are still people who say, well, the crop is bent in a way that it grows in a certain way that's not like a simple mechanical pushing and so on. And there seemed to be that kind of evidence. Then there were some tests, and particularly by a BBC, a chap in the BBC here called John McNeish, who went out with the people who had confessed to hoaxing a lot of crop circles, Doug and Dave, they were known as. He went out with them and he challenged them to do all the things that the crop circle believers said couldn't be done naturally. He said, can you do a straight line for a quarter of a mile? They did a half a mile. Could they do this? Could they do that? And the fact is that whether crop circles are being done in microwave energies or UFOs, test beds or whatever else, the fact is that these people could create perfect crop circles.
If it was nothing more than a series of hoaxes, then how did the perpetrators get into the fields without leaving a trace behind? Mystery lovers enjoy questions such as that. Between 1989 and 1994, a small group of French investigators called the Northeastern Committee of Ufology Groups, or CNEGU as it was known, visited southern England repeatedly to study the crop circles. The researchers did not take long to find a human explanation for the phenomenon. Gilles Munch found no mystery in the lack of traces near the crop circles.
La plupart des centres des cercles, c'est toujours valable en 2000.
Most of the centers of the crop circles can still be seen in 2003.
La plupart des cercles.
Most of the circle centers were on tractor lines, but a small percentage of them were outside of tractor lines.
Donc, comment
How could these tractor lines be reached to make the circles?
se faisait de façon pragmatique avec, par exemple,
We were convinced that the circles were being made in a pragmatic fashion by perhaps two people holding a rope. They couldn't do anything until they reached the center, and they had to walk carefully through the field.
qu'on pouvait très bien, notamment dans les champs de blé, se déplacer sans laisser.
It's been proven on film that if a person takes precautions, he can walk across a field without leaving a trace.
À force de faire des crop circles.
But after several crop circles were made, we noticed that people were no longer taking precautions. They were walking on the crops.
Tout le monde acceptait
People were rushing to get to the center of the circle, leaving traces behind them.
les traces.
Once at the center, they could design the shapes as complex as they wished.
Créer toute la figure, aussi complexe soit-elle.
In fact, we found paths left by these people in wheat fields that we thoroughly examined. Well, we'd call them paths. Someone has walked through the field, 1 foot in front of the other, and has trampled the stalks 2 inches around the center area. But the center area is long, and we need to find the starting point. There is only one radius, and it lies hidden under the flattened crops. If we don't look carefully, we can't find it. Apparently, no one was looking, and as soon as we began, we would find the radius. It got to the point where we were able to judge where to look before even entering the field. I'd say we are accurate about 95% of the time. I've never calculated the statistics. The times that we didn't find it where we expected to, it was usually a bit off to the side. It was a random variable that led to this error in logic. From then on, there were hints other than the paths, but they were the most revealing.
First of all, with crop circles, I first looked at a ring or patch of vegetation associated with a UFO report in Canada in about 1975. This was long before crop circles were commonly referred to and found in England. In fact, in England they did not start until about 1980-81. But I was not at all impressed with some of what I had seen. In fact, over the years I have personally caught or had confessions from people who had made some of these circles for their own purposes as a lark to confound and puzzle people. Although in the early days, in the early 1970s, there were some very intriguing cases in Manitoba and Saskatchewan where objects had been reported to be seen landing and taking off and leaving behind patches. Now we just simply see these rather elaborate formations most often in England, and the assumption is that they are somehow related to UFOs, but very, very few cases are reported. I would tend to think that these are two very disparate phenomena. The cases where an object is seen to land and take off and leave behind a patch, as opposed to a crop formation, very elaborate, very, very difficult to make mathematically perhaps, but still possible to be made by hoaxers, because I believe the evidence is there that hoaxers are making the crop circle phenomenon around the world, not just one or two, but many, many, and many have admitted how they have done it. So I believe the crop circle phenomenon is not a real UFO phenomenon, if I can use the term real in that sense.
To prove that crop circles are an extraordinary occurrence, several people quote American biophysicist W.C. Levengood, who claims to have found significant differences between plant samples taken from inside of a crop circle versus samples taken from outside of the formation. Since he did not hide his conviction that crop circles are real, his objectivity and scientific methods have been questioned.
Some of the proponents of crop circles being something more than just pavement artistry or whatever, being some kind of truly paranormal phenomenon, have pointed to researchers such as those of Dr. Livingood, who have said that there is an actual modification to the DNA or the way that the crop is growing or some kind of effect on the crop itself. And that may be true, and it's not for me particularly challenging, but I would challenge the general claim because I know from looking at some of the evidence that sometimes there is bad science in there. I'm not pointing the finger at any individual there, but sometimes there is bad science. For example, the people know where the samples are coming from. They say this is from a crop circle, etc. Now, true science on this nature should have double-blind tests. There should be crop that isn't from a crop circle, crop that's from near the crop circle, crop that's from inside the crop circle, which they don't know what they're analysing. And I've always remembered the story, which I'm not a biologist, but I think I get the general gist of it, which was that when they were studying the chromosome count in the human genes, in the human cells, that there was a belief that there was 48, and then there was a belief that there were 46, and scientists would actually get the microscope out, look at the chromosomes and count them, and they counted 46, and they were sure there was 46, and then someone said, actually no, if you count them, there's 48, and when they counted them all again, they found there was 48. Even scientists see what they want to see sometimes, and they get blinded to the things that they can miss. And I think crop circles, very few people have started out totally neutral. Those people that you go to analyse your sample usually are sceptics who want to prove that they're nothing, or they are believers who want to bolster the proof. And there hasn't been, in my view, good scientific analysis of the samples from crop circles, and if there were, I don't think that there would probably be a great deal of difference between the samples themselves, because I don't think crop circles do have an exotic story. But with good science, we could either prove that there wasn't, or we could prove that there was, and then I'd have more faith in those claims.
In the past, and sometimes now as well, we can detect flaws in the crop circles, now that we've gotten used to looking for them. If it were truly an extraordinary phenomenon, or one that reflected an intelligence above that of human beings, we would expect to see shapes that were geometrically perfect, which is not the case for most crop circles. That's my first point. My second point is that using basic human technology, nodes and flattened stalks are feasible. It would be much more disturbing to see fields where the stalks had been bent at the top only, not at the base. That would be a lot harder for humans to do. Or instead of flattening all of the stalks in the same direction, why not intertwine the stalks as they are flattened? That would also be very difficult for humans to do, especially using basic technology. Or instead of flattening the shape of a crop circle, why not flatten the rest of the field and leave stalks standing to create a design? To be beyond human technology, we would have to imagine things that were very much more difficult to imitate, which would leave no doubt as to their mysterious origin, without making it clear what that origin might be.
These days, there are fewer and fewer defenders of the possible exotic origins of crop circles. Human techniques are so well known now that it appears more and more improbable that they are extraterrestrial in origin. Even films supposedly showing the creation of crop circles by small balls of light have been revealed as clever hoaxes. But if they're nothing more than hoaxes, what motivates people to create them?
Notre conviction était qu'il s'agissait, à ce moment-là,
We're convinced that it is land art created by artists who made these shapes in the fields just for fun, as a sort of challenge, a competition perhaps between groups with different lines of thinking. The fact that there are different types of shapes and different designs, which are like a trademark signature, leads us to believe that there may be a challenge between different groups of people, perhaps schools, since we figured that students are the sort of person who might be likely to do something like this. Making a crop circle doesn't require much time, so it could be done during school holidays. A certain knowledge of geometry and math are required, as well as a logical approach to organization. You don't need a very high level of education to be able to make a crop circle. You just need the right education. In England, challenges between schools are quite popular. So it follows naturally that crop circles might be land art competitions between artists.
Since the confessions of Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley, other artists have come forward. These teams of crop circle builders, such as the Bill Bailey Gang, Merlin and Company, and Spider-Man and Catwoman, are now well known by the British press. In November 2000, one of these artists, Matthew Williams, a computer technician, became the first crop circle creator to be fined for having damaged a field. Proof that fame has its price. Off the U.S. coast, bordered by Bermuda, the Florida Peninsula, and the island of Puerto Rico, is a vast expanse of ocean where hundreds of ships and aircraft have mysteriously disappeared. It is known as the Bermuda Triangle. It is said that this area has been the site of inexplicable occurrences for centuries. Navigators dating back as far as Christopher Columbus claim to have seen extraordinary lights in the sky. Sailors have also seen strange lights below the sea, referred to as USOs, unidentified submarine objects. The most famous disappearance in the Bermuda Triangle happened on December 5th, 1945. That day, a squadron of 5 Avenger bombers took off from the Fort Lauderdale Air Force Base. The squadron was to fly east, bomb an old ship hulk anchored off the coast of Florida, and return to base, a routine exercise. At around 3:40 p.m., Lieutenant Charles Taylor, leader of the squadron, informed the base that he seemed to be lost and his instruments were not functioning properly. He added that he believed he was over the Florida Keys. Controllers tried desperately to lead the squadron back to the ground. Eventually, they lost radio contact. Search operations began around 7:30 p.m. in the belief that Flight 19 had probably run out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. As if the loss of the squadron was not enough, the seaplane sent out in search of Flight 19 exploded off the coast of Fort Lauderdale. The final count for that fateful day, 27 men disappeared and 6 aircraft were lost, 5 Avengers and 1 Martin Mariner. The U.S. Navy concluded that Flight 19 had disappeared due to pilot error. No wreckage of this legendary squadron was ever found. What became of those aircraft and the men aboard? Mystery lovers interpret the events that occurred in the Bermuda Triangle as proof of extraterrestrial activity.
One thing associated with UFOs quite a lot is the so-called Bermuda Triangle mystery, which is that an area of land and sea, mostly sea, just off the Bermudan, off the west coast of America, off the near Bermuda, has a huge amount of ship and plane losses that happen there. And the first thing to know, I mean, it has been studied by many people. In fact, almost my namesake originally, a chap called John Wallace Spencer, known relation of mine, studied it a great deal. And if you like, the skeptical side studied by a chap called Lawrence David Couche, who brought a book out on this as well. And the one thing that does become apparent is that the Bermuda Triangle, if it's nothing else, is also a statistical blip. There are more planes and boats running around in that area, and there is undoubtedly losses because there are inexperienced people with boats. It's a millionaire's playground. The Coast Guards have reported people trying to run around with world atlases when they should have very detailed maps because they can come to harm with shifting sandbanks and so on. Plus you have a high incident of drug running and so on, where ships are captured and then sunk afterwards, etc. So the Bermuda Triangle may not be any more special in terms of the amount of planes and losses than anywhere else. That said, within the Bermuda Triangle, and it has to be said in other parts of the world, but there are several in the Bermuda Triangle, very, very strange stories. One of, or several of which I think might be explained by the looking now at the release of methane gases, which actually makes the water non-supportive, and suddenly you become non-buoyant in the water, and ships could literally just sink because they're in this kind of huge methane gas release. And more studies need to be done in that, but there's been some very good science on that. Probably the most famous report in the Bermuda Triangle is, however, I think, one of the true mysteries of the world, and that is that Flight 19 got lost. and was never seen again. I mean, they haven't really been found since. They have found a lot of these types of planes under the Bermuda Triangle, in the sea, but in fact they were used for bombing raids and things, so they haven't found those planes. Effectively, a flight of planes went out, seems to have got lost. They were in contact all the time with their base. They said we can't. They were describing that the sea looked wrong, the sky looked wrong. They were changing direction here, changing direction there. They were never seen again. They were an inexperienced crew, although their leader was an experienced trainer and should have been able to get them back to base safely. It's possible that they could have just got lost and eventually run out of fuel and dropped in the sea. And were that the only part of the mystery, that would be enough. But what then happened was that, having created a fuss in the first place, they then sent out a very experienced rescue crew in a Mariner flying boat to go and find them. And that never came back either. That almost certainly exploded and was destroyed. And that, I think, is a coincidence too far. That really does need some more explanation. One possibility being, of course, that there was some huge, genuine electromagnetic surge that was messing up all their compasses, etc., and eventually even triggered the gas tanks of the Martin Mariner, which was known to be a bit unstable in terms of its safety and so on. But that means that there was an unusual discharge of something going on in the triangle. And that, for me, means that whatever the statistics on the triangle are, and I actually don't think the triangle is quite the mystery it's made out to be in that way, but there is something strange happened then, has happened on a few other occasions in the triangle, and it may be that there is something really, some kind of, maybe a meteorite under there or something in that area which actually does have an effect occasionally.
There is a huge myth surrounding the Bermuda Triangle, which has been perpetuated by best-selling novels such as those written by Charles Berlitz. People wonder where ships and aircraft go when they disappear, especially the famous squadron of 5 Avengers that left Fort Lauderdale in 1945 and disappeared. And then the seaplane that was sent out to find them disappeared also. That leads some people to believe that they have gone into another dimension, or perhaps they are trapped in time. One explanation is that UFOs are behind the mystery. There is also a theory about a time portal. And of course, there's always the possibility of whirlpools sucking them underwater. It's an unstable area. UFO researchers claim that not only are the pilots and sailors being abducted by aliens, but also their aircraft and ships. In the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, we see the Avengers reappear in the desert at the beginning, and then the pilots return at the end. So I think that this film only served to perpetuate the myth, since we also see a ship in the Gobi Desert at the beginning of the movie. The only clear link between UFOs and the Bermuda Triangle is the fact that UFOs have been spotted over the Bermuda Triangle, like so many other places. But the Bermuda Triangle holds a special place in the hearts of mystery lovers, due to all of the disappearances that have occurred in that area.
A century ago, Charles Fort, a New York journalist, began gathering stories about extraordinary occurrences, such as tales of raining frogs, mysterious disappearances, unexplained objects in the sky, unknown creatures, and much more. Charles Fort became the first person to document the world of mystery. In his honor, strange occurrences are now referred to as Fortean phenomena. Fort understood that the world is sometimes a stranger place than we may think, whether or not they are related to UFOs. The oddities documented by Charles Fort continue to fascinate readers. The universe is infinite, not only in terms of time and space, but also what can be found within. It has a multitude of unknown laws and inexplicable facts. The endless stories of oddities only go to prove this.